Well, this morning I want to speak about the call to discipleship. Last week we heard about the opposition that Jesus' ministry provoked. Josh spoke about Jesus talking at the synagogue in Nazareth and his words angering the people of his hometown who led him off to a cliff to throw him down. And I remember when he said that, I looked across at Sue because 2 years ago we were standing on the Mount of Precipice outside Nazareth, looking down on the Great Plain and seeing the reality of that. His ministry aroused opposition, but this morning we see another side of the story. Jesus' ministry inspiring intense loyalty from followers as he calls his first disciples. This chapter is the beginning of him calling disciples. Later in the chapter he calls Levi, the tax collector, and in the next chapter he chooses 12 of his disciples as apostles. But this morning I want to focus on the call of Peter in particular. And this isn't working, by the way. If we could move it on. Yeah. I wonder if we were holding a survey of people's favourite disciples this morning, who would be your favourite? I love the character of Andrew, Peter's brother. He's the one who introduces Peter to Jesus. He's the one who notices the young lad with the loaves and the fishes. And he's the one who brings Greek inquirers to see Jesus. He never made it to the inner three, but he's always there in the background, leading people to Jesus. And I've got quite a soft spot for Thomas, the one who's willing to ask stupid questions, who doesn't really understand and finds it hard to believe, and yet he's willing to go to Jerusalem to die with Jesus. But I guess if we're choosing favourite disciples, Peter generally comes out top of the list. Here's someone we can understand, someone we can relate to in our own discipleship. Peter was no stained glass saint, but someone who was all too human. Big, brash and impulsive, bold in his faith and enthusiasm, opinionated and emotional, quick to talk and quick to make a whole load of mistakes. John MacArthur calls Peter the disciple with a foot-shaped mouth. He was always putting his foot in it. Peter was always at the forefront, acting as the spokesman for the other disciples. Peter, whose heart always seems to rule his head, who steps out in faith and then is overwhelmed by doubt. Peter, who recognises who Jesus is in that great ringing confession of faith at Caesarea Philippi, but then immediately goes on to balk at the implications of the path that Jesus was determined to tread. Peter, who was confused in the presence of Christ's glory, who swears loyalty so fiercely to his Lord, but then in the same night finds himself betraying him. Peter, who Jesus so lovingly restores after his resurrection and calls to a new ministry of caring for his sheep. At different times, Peter got it all wrong, and yet it seems to me that we love him because there's a lot of Peter in all of us. On my bookshelf at home, I've got a book called Just Like Us by J. Oswald Sanders. And on the cover is a picture of a modern man in a suit looking in a mirror. And staring back out at him, out of the mirror, is a bearded man dressed in biblical clothes. And Sanders wants to make the point that in many ways the biblical characters were just like us. Sometimes when we look at Peter, we see ourselves in the mirror. Of course, we're not all possessed of his bold and extrovert character, but we're all prone to putting our foot in it spiritually. If we're Christians and we love Jesus, We want to follow him in our lives. And yet, over and over again, we can make a mess of it. So we can all learn from Peter in our own discipleship as we seek to walk with Jesus. Peter failed often, and yet by God's grace, he became a rock. And that's good news for us. You see, the real hero of Peter's story isn't Peter, it's Jesus. It was Jesus who called him and transformed him, who equipped him to fulfill the calling he was given. One preacher, Sinclair Ferguson, says, Peter's life is proof that growth can take place despite failure. And that strikes me as pretty good news. Peter's life is proof that growth can take place despite failure. Indeed, in Peter's case, growth continued despite repeated failure. Peter's failures were very real, but they couldn't destroy what God intended to do in his life. God was at work in his life, developing in him the stability and assurance which would later be seen in his apostolic ministry. And this is where it all starts in this passage this morning. It's not the first time that Peter has met Jesus, of course. When I was younger, I was puzzled by that verse in Mark 1:16 where it says, as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. It makes it sound like they'd never met Jesus before, and they just left everything and followed him. But John's Gospel, chapter 1, makes it clear that Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, had heard John the Baptist talking about Jesus. And then he followed him, and then he introduced Peter to Jesus. But this is the moment of Peter's decisive call to discipleship. And it's a story which has lessons for all of us. Because God is at work in our lives also, calling us to follow him and become the person he wants us to be. So I want to look more closely at the story under three headings. Firstly, Christ's knowledge, or Peter catches fish. Secondly, our heart condition, or Jesus catches Peter. And lastly, Christ's mission, or Peter and us sent out to fish. So, firstly, Christ's knowledge, or Peter catches fish. The setting here is the water's edge at the Lake of Gennesaret, another name for the Sea of Galilee, where fishermen were sitting by their boats, washing their nets after a hard night's work. 2 years ago, Sue and I were visiting the area of Galilee, and we visited Peter's adopted hometown, Capernaum, just along from Gennesaret. And while we were there, I stopped beside the Sea of Galilee, greatly humbled to be there in this place where my Saviour had stood. Later, we went on a boat, out on a boat on the lake, and we saw a fishing net being cast. Back on dry ground, we were shown the Jesus boat, the first century fishing boat which had been discovered preserved in the mud at the lake's shore. And at Magdala, Susan even ate one of the fish from the lake known as St. Peter's fish. And all I can say is rather her than me. I'm not much of a fish eater, especially when they've still got the head on with the eyes looking up at you. But Peter would have been all too familiar with this location and its fish. So our story begins with a frustrated fisherman cleaning his nets after a long, hard night. Fishing is hard work. In the first century, fishing meant going out on the Sea of Galilee at night, casting your nets into the water, fishing all night, and then coming ashore at daybreak. Now the long night was over, and Peter and others were cleaning their nets so they could go fishing all over again when the night came. I'm guessing that they were tired and exhausted. And in this context, Jesus comes along and asks Peter for the use of his boat as a kind of floating pulpit to address the crowds that had gathered on the shore. And I guess that was fine with Peter. It was a small thing really, but it would lead to the miracle which changed Peter's life. After the preaching, Jesus challenges Peter to a much greater step of faith. Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Astonishing. A carpenter or telling a fisherman what to do. Doesn't Jesus know that what he's saying is humanly impossible? In the middle of the day with the sunlight on the water, there's no way that they would catch fish there. They fish at night because the fish come closer to the surface. It was a ridiculous thing that Jesus was saying. Experienced fishermen have fished all through the night and caught nothing. Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. Peter must have felt like saying, sorry, Lord, I'm the expert here. But no, because you say so, I will let down the nets. I love the way Peter puts it, because you say so. In the King James Version, the phrase is, nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the nets. Years ago, we had a mission here with Roger Carswell. And we had a beautiful banner which Marion gave us with artwork by her friend, which said, at thy word, I will let down the nets. Nevertheless, at thy word. So often we go by our own thinking and our own ways. But nevertheless, at thy word. That, if you like, is the watchword of the saints. Across the ages, believers have found those words to be their marching orders. Things may look dark. We may sometimes face overwhelming circumstances and be almost overcome by fear. But when Christ speaks, his followers must be ready to say, nevertheless, at thy word, and step out in faith. Remember how middle-aged Abraham set off across the desert with no more than this. Nevertheless, at thy word. Noah built an ark in the face of a hostile and unbelieving world with no more than this. Nevertheless, at thy word. Moses defied the mighty Pharaoh. Humanly speaking, it was sheer madness. And yet with God, he triumphed against all the odds. Nevertheless, at thy word. And when Peter lets down the nets, the result is abundant blessing. He acts in obedience, probably with very little faith, but he acts with obedience, and the result is abundant blessing. What a sight. So many fish came into the nets that they began to break. The men ended up filling the boats with so many fish that they began to sink. Of course, the amazing thing is those fish were there in the water the night before, but Peter and the other fishermen couldn't find them. But when Jesus is in the boat, everything changes. And I think it's a lesson that we all need to learn. When we trust in ourselves, we're often fruitless spiritually. But when we step out in obedience to God, so often we find abundant blessings. May the Lord make us sensitive to his voice and obedient to his call. He knows exactly where to fish. And when he directs us and empowers us, we can expect the fish to be there. I pray regularly with Alan Dismore for revival and some of the accounts of the Hebridean revival. There were times when the Spirit came in revival, there were times when it was almost as people were falling over themselves to respond to the gospel. It was almost as if the fish were trying to jump into the boat as God's Spirit moved among them in that place. So I would just say, may God send such times again, because how we long to hear God's voice and see such a catch. So firstly, we see Peter catching fish. And then secondly, Jesus catches Peter as we see the reality of our human condition. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and his companions were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. Let's face it, Peter knows all about fishing. He and his companions were well aware this couldn't happen in the normal course of events. This was miraculous beyond their wildest expectations. So when Peter sees this net-breaking catch, he suddenly becomes aware of spiritual realities. He suddenly becomes aware of his own sinful state. And fear drives him to his knees. I guess Peter had dreamed of a catch like this all his life. And yet when it came, he was scared to death. One writer and songwriter, Michael Card, says, it is as if he has become the frightened fish, thrashing in the net, wanting only to get away, or at least for Jesus to get away from him. As Sinclair Ferguson describes it, Peter became conscious of the power and majesty of Jesus, and the effect was dramatic. For Peter, this was a moment of profound self-understanding. All his illusions about his own worthiness were demolished in the presence of the overwhelming holiness of Christ. All he could say when confronted by him was, "I have sinned." He understood more fully who he himself was. He felt himself undone, his sinfulness exposed before the presence of this Jesus. All he knew was that he was a sinner. It's a scene reminiscent of Isaiah's reaction upon seeing the Lord high and lifted up. "Woe to me," I cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Isaiah 6, verse 5. Isaiah experienced in many ways the same that Peter experienced here. Once Peter realized who Jesus was, he saw himself in a new light. To see God in all his holiness is to see ourselves as we really are, sinners in desperate need of mercy. Each one of us must come to this moment of realization before we're ready to receive salvation from God and begin to truly follow him. And it doesn't come easily. It doesn't fit with our normal human pride, our normal perception. But the reality is that we all fall short of a holy God, and we need his mercy. It wasn't going to be the last time that Peter needed to be brought face to face with his own sin and failure. But when Peter fell on his knees before Jesus, the treatment had begun. He could never really be the same again. Here is a man who's been deeply changed on the inside. His pride has been burned away by a transforming vision of Christ. From now on, he's called to follow Jesus as his disciple, and his life would never be the same. His life was under radical reconstruction, as ours must be, if we understand just who Jesus is and the radical claims he makes on our lives. So I wonder, have you understood who Jesus is? Have you realized that in Jesus, that when we encounter Jesus, we're in the presence of the holy God, and recognized the reality of our own sinful nature, the sinfulness of our hearts, and how much we need to fall at his knees and seek his mercy. The wonderful news is that he stands ready to forgive and to release each one of us to new life because of what happened at the cross. So, firstly, Peter catches fish. Secondly, Jesus catches Peter. And then lastly, Jesus sends Peter and us to be fishers of men. When Jesus told Peter to go out into the deeper water and put down the nets, Peter had no idea how his life was about to change. You might say he took the bait and fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. Because Jesus has a new purpose for his life. It's interesting that Jesus seems to ignore Peter's desperate confession of unworthiness. Jesus knew the truth about Peter. He'd known it all along. What matters is that Peter now knows the truth about himself. With his pride stripped away, he's ready to serve the Lord. And Jesus responds with wonderful grace. Don't be afraid, he says to Peter. I've got a job for you. When we recognize that we're sinners, Jesus not only forgives us, but he gives us a new life, a new purpose in following him. And whoever we are, however we have fallen short before God, he has a purpose for our lives. He has a job for us. He is able to use us and in his service to bring him glory. And what was the response? So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. In the New Testament, faith means following Jesus, and Jesus calls us to follow him also. Peter Maiden, in his book on discipleship, says, there are no half measures with Jesus. The call to follow transforms every area of our lives. This is the Lord of heaven and earth calling us to follow him. Are we ready to follow, giving him everything, making him the Lord of our lives? What do we think we're being asked to sign up for when we are challenged to follow Christ? We need to understand from the beginning that this is new birth, and no stone of our lives can remain unturned. No one can meet Jesus and walk away unchanged. The call to discipleship is a call to relationship. It's not just following a set of rules, but walking with Jesus. And following Jesus takes all we've got. But you know what? It's worth it. I remember when I was courting Susan years and years ago. One night after I visited her at the student house she was living in, I walked back across Reading on the night of the 1987 hurricane. Maybe, I think it was 1987, wasn't it? 3 miles through terrific, battering wind and rain. But you know what? I had no complaints. I'd do it again. To love and serve Jesus. If we love Jesus, we'll want to serve him. To love and serve Jesus is the normal response of those who understand who he is and appreciate what he's done for them. And if we're disciples of Jesus, we cannot ignore the priority that he gives to mission. From now on, you will fish for people. Or as Jesus says in Matthew 4, verse 19, "Come follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people. I will make you fishers of men," as the familiar version puts it. And the same call surely comes to us. We're surrounded by those who do not yet know the love of Christ. As a church, we must always remain committed to gospel outreach. As John Stott said, Jesus is the light of the world. We cannot keep him to ourselves. Christianity is inescapably a missionary faith. And again, as Peter Maiden says, if we desire to be disciples of Jesus, then he desires that we should be fishers of men. Being part of a church can be comforting, but church is not meant to be a comfort club. It's meant to be a rescue society, reaching out. And we need to find those different ways to reach out to the society around us with the gospel message. We need to be hearing the Lord's voice and stepping out in obedience and faith as Peter did. May the Lord motivate our hearts to reach out to others with the gospel message. There are all kinds of ways in which we can do that, from individual conversations to inviting people along, to serving with Messy Church or youth, or all kinds of different ways. But may the Lord motivate our hearts with that gospel message. And remember what happened when Peter put out into the deep and let down his nets at Christ's command. They caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And it says, he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. When we act in obedience to the Lord, there may be times where we see abundant fruitfulness. Obedience to the Lord's word is the way, not trusting in our own strength, but listening to his voice and stepping out in faith and obedience. So may God empower us as a church and as individuals to be fishers of men and to draw others to Christ. In Jesus' name, amen.